Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion was one of my most anticipated games this year when it was announced back in June for the Final Fantasy VII Anniversary event. I was very interested in how they were going to change the gameplay since the original's gameplay was pretty bad if we're going to be honest. But to be fair, the game was on the PSP, so there was only so much you could do with the gameplay. But the entire game was an auto battler that relied heavily on the DMW mechanic. So that made the entire game just RNG. But for this remaster, they made big changes to the gameplay so it doesn't have that complete reliance on RNG. It's still there, because the DMW mechanic is still there, but not as much. For example, the game is no longer an auto battler, it's more similar to the Final Fantasy VII Remake combat. Just a very simplified version of it, which works well for this game since it's supposed to be a smaller game in general. The new combat made the entire game way more enjoyable than it used to be. They also added an ability gauge to enemies when they're going to do an ultimate attack, and it gives you a chance to weaken the attack or stop it entirely if you are strong enough and fast enough. This comes with its own issues, to where if you are underleveled, you will most likely just die from these ultimate attacks, since you can't do enough damage to the gauge to stop the attack from happening. It's pretty frustrating when that happens. So it just makes these underlevel encounters with stronger enemies nearly impossible on hard mode specifically. I should mention I played the entire game on hard mode and it made the side quests way more challenging, and it is a struggle in the late game side quests. The later side quests in this game just suck. Almost every enemy has the status effect death on one of their attacks, and I just feel as though giving every enemy that type of attack is just lazy and an artificial way to make the game more difficult. It always feels cheap and unfair when every enemy in the fight all do their death attacks at the same time, which forces you to equip a death ward accessory or just die over and over. The side quests in general are a grind, but that grind can be fun when you're working towards a goal, like materia fusion, which is a lot of fun since the game lets you experiment with the mechanic and it's pretty easy to make yourself overpowered for the story. It just depends on how much work you want to put into it. The thing that makes side quests such a grind is the fact that they are all just hallways with a different theme and different enemies. They don't really do anything special with level design because there isn't much. It's just hallways. The whole game is actually just hallways, if I'm going to be honest. Like, the main focus point in this game is the combat. I personally don't recommend doing all the quests on the first playthrough. It can ruin the overall experience. The side quests were made to be played in short bursts, which explains why they don't have much variety when it comes to actual design of them. I am going to say now, for all the people who don't want to be spoiled, leave now, because I'm going to be mentioning spoilers for the story. Now moving on to the actual story part of the game, it is overall a solid story that can be a bit rough to get through at certain parts. The reason why I think that is because they kept the same voice direction as the original PSP version, which doesn't make sense to me at all, since they retranslated and re-recorded the lines. So they could have given better voice direction to make the dialogue sound natural instead of super awkward like how it is now. I just don't understand what was the point of going through all that work just to make the dialogue awkward intentionally and not in a good way. For example, there's one conversation in the game between Zack and Cisne where they're having a conversation that's supposed to be emotional, but then after a few lines the tone of the conversation just completely switches and it's very jarring and weird.
When I was a kid, I always wanted to have wings. You know, like an angel.
If people had wings, they'd be monsters.
Wings symbolize freedom for those who have none. They don't symbolize monsters. Impressive, Soldier First Class. You've got skill.
Well, unlike the Turks, fighting's our main thing.
Here, a little gift for helping me out. Alright then, I'm off to the next job. You've got something too, right?
Yeah, I do.
Until we meet again.
The voice acting in this game isn't bad. I just think the voice direction needs work, which confuses me even more because Final Fantasy VII Remake's voice direction was really good. Everyone in that game talked like real people and it all felt natural. But that's besides the point. Going back to Crisis Core, I'm one of the few people who actually like the new cast more than the old cast. I think Zack's new voice fits him perfectly, since he's a young kid who wants to be a hero. So of course he's not going to sound cool right away. He's got to grow into that, which is what he ends up doing, and it's great to see and hear. This game has some amazing characters overall, like actually seeing who Zack is and what he went through just enhances the overall story for Final Fantasy VII. Seeing his friendship with Cloud and Sephiroth are some of the best moments in the game. As a Sephiroth fan, it was nice seeing him as a good person, somewhat, and how he interacts with others before he went crazy. It also has full voice acting this time. The game did the impossible. It made me like Aerith. Her interactions with Zack were amazing, and I actually like her now. Before I used to just tolerate her, but now I think she's pretty good. This is probably the hottest take for Crisis Core, but I think Genesis is a great character that has a lot of potential. I know most people find him annoying that he's quoting Loveless the entire game, but I find it interesting that he's constantly quoting the book simply because it gives me the idea that he doesn't know what his purpose is in life, and he thinks he's the hero chosen by the goddess, which is why he's constantly talking about being the next hero. I can see him being confused on what's happening too because of his degradation and how Loveless is not finished. The final act was never put out or whatever, and he doesn't know what's happening, so now he's desperately searching for a cure, and that's why he teamed up with Hollander. And when that failed, he just accepted his fate and decided he was going to complete his duty as soldier and have a final duel with Zack. And when he loses that final duel, he lands in the life stream, and the statue in the cave that they were fighting in morphs into the goddess. And after seeing his desire to complete his final duty, she heals his degradation completely. He is then left in a weakened state, which at that point Zack drags him out of the cave and helps him complete his childhood wish, which was eating Benora apples with his friends. And Zack apologizes for it not being the real thing and leaves with Cloud. Genesis passes out there. Genesis is then picked up by Weiss and Nero, who are part of Deep Ground, which is some dirge stuff, which actually interests me what they're gonna do with him, since we may be taking a different path than the usual Final Fantasy VII timeline. But I'm interested since his story with his need for Loveless has ended with the last page of the story filling out, and it is narrated by Genesis. I understand why people don't like him, but I just find him entertaining and a character that has an interesting future since we don't know what happens. Going back to the gameplay, I want to talk about some of the bosses in Crisis Core. I'm going to talk about the summon bosses first, since they are pretty similar, if I'm going to be honest. These fights just really revolve around the ability gauge, nothing too special. Just some good fun against a big enemy. Which actually brings me to my next point about most boss fights in this game. The battles are just about being strong enough to either tank or stop the ability gauge in general. There are a few that do some other things, like add additional enemies on the battlefield. For example, the first Sephiroth boss fight, which is one of my favorites from the game, is when he summons these giant materias of like different elements, and you have to fight them while battling him. It's an interesting fight that I wish did more, but it's still fun because it has that little bit of variety in how you need to mix up your style and how to take out each materia. Now for my favorite fights in the game, the two final Genesis fight. The first fight is against Genesis Avatar. For this fight, you have to attack his sword and battle the other Genesis clones that are being spawned in at the same time while using magic attacks to hit his body, since you can't reach him with melee attacks. He has quite a bit of health, but I just really find this fight fun. It's nothing too special, but I think it's just a great big final set piece. For the second fight against Genesis, it's a one-on-one duel, and I love one-on-one duels in games, so I'm very biased with this fight, since it just does what I love most for final battles, which is just a straight-up fight with the final boss. So like I said before, most of the boss fights in this game are stopping the ability gauge, which isn't bad, but it can be a bit repetitive, like most of the game in general, where it doesn't mix up the combat too much, since they leave it up to you to experiment with materia fusion. But there's only so much you can do with that. They also added another mechanic with the remaster called Buster Sword Proficiency, where you take a stance that's similar to Punisher mode from Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it just gives you the status effect Endure and strengthens you for your next attack. It doesn't add too much, but it's a fun little bonus, and it helped me out with a few fights. Now moving on to one of the worst fights I've ever had the displeasure of doing, the Minerva Super Boss on hard mode. This fight sucks, just to get that out of the way. I genuinely think this fight is a bad fight, and that it is filled with everything that is cheap and unfair. The boss abilities were either boring or annoying to deal with. You have to supercharge Zack to even stand a chance, which I get is normal for super bosses in JRPGs. But I've played a good amount of JRPGs with good super bosses. For example, Kingdom Hearts 2 has multiple fantastic super bosses that are really well designed, and most of them are fun to fight and figure out. Like Lingering Will is fun to fight, even though he's really hard to beat, and it got frustrating at times, because it was a matter of recognizing his patterns and how he can mix you up with his abilities. Just an overall amazing fight that tests you on the mechanics of the game. Gave a brief explanation of that because I wanted to do a video on Cage 2 at a later date, but I'll go into more detail when I get there. But my point is that the Minerva boss fight isn't really hard, it's just boring. You are rolling around the battlefield constantly to avoid her cheap abilities that basically one-shot you. But even then, I can get over that if her attack called Flash Slash didn't take away your Phoenix Down when it hit you on hard mode. That move is most likely going to one-shot you and you'll just die. Her ultimate attack does the same exact thing. It's really hard to break her ability gauge, so you'll just have to tank the attack, which sucks since if you aren't strong enough, you'll just die no matter what. And I just don't think that's good design, because no matter how skilled you are at the game, you will never be able to beat this fight if you're even a little bit under level. I personally just think that's horrible design for an action RPG. Since these type of games have some type of execution to them, I feel like if you are good enough at the game, you should be able to beat the super boss while not being at max level. Especially for a game like this where grinding to get levels isn't fun at all. It's just a pain. But my biggest problem with this fight is the total health on hard mode. She has 77,777,777 total health. The maximum amount of damage you can do is 99,999. That will take about 770 hits to defeat her. That's so time consuming and boring. Nothing in this fight makes it interesting except having to dodge some cheap attacks from hitting you. Even looking into the same series, Final Fantasy VII Remake has amazing super bosses that require strategy and great execution. I will say, though, for Final Fantasy VII Remake boss fights, you're gonna have to be max level for those fights too, but that game's max level isn't level 99, it's level 50. And by the end of the game, when you get the ability to challenge those bosses, you'll be near max, so you don't have to worry about being under level. So it's not really an issue there. But for Crisis Core, the max level is 99. I finished every other side quest in the game and I was only in my 70s. So to even stand a chance on hard mode, I have to grind for 20 more levels. That's ridiculous and super time consuming. I eventually gave up and decided to do the fight on normal, where she has 10 million health. which isn't too much compared to hard mode. Also, Flash Slash doesn't take away your Phoenix down, which makes the fight more bearable. But her ultimate does still take away the Phoenix down, but it's not that big of a deal on normal. For my final thoughts on this fight, I hate it, and I don't recommend anyone doing this fight unless you're going for the Platinum Trophy. And if you're gonna do the fight on normal. Trust me, you're just gonna be wasting a lot of time and energy on a fight that sucks if you do it on hard. Now I'll give my final thoughts on Crisis Core. I like this game a lot. I feel like it adds a lot to the story of Final Fantasy VII and shows the player the story of Zack and how important he is to FF7. It got me to change my mind on how I feel about certain characters like Aerith. The gameplay was just mindless fun. I was able to relax for about 80% of my playthrough. It was a great refresher for Crisis Core before Rebirth comes out next year. This remaster is a perfect replacement for the original PSP game. I do think you should get this game if you enjoyed FF7R and are looking forward to Rebirth. You need to play this game so you are familiar with Zack and who he is, since it seems he's going to have a bigger role in Rebirth. With that being said, I'll catch you guys in my next video. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any videos in the future. Also leave a comment with your thoughts on the game. I like to have a discussion. See you in the next one.